Just get out of the way, lady. This is a restricted technical area for qualified personnel, not a tour stop for some desk jockeys. The crowd of young, eager ensigns and seasoned instructors snickered, the sound echoing uncomfortably in the cavernous, climate-controlled chill of the simulator bay. The woman, dressed in a plain, olive-drab flight suit devoid of any rank, name, or squadron patch, offered no reaction. She did not flinch, did not blush, did not even meet the gunnery sergeant's condescending gaze. Her attention remained fixed on the primary diagnostic console, her eyes tracking the silent, cascading lines of code with an unnerving stillness. But across the room, the base commander, Captain Miller, paused, a styrofoam cup of coffee halfway to his lips. He saw her stance, the subtle, almost imperceptible way she distributed her weight, a posture of perfect, relaxed readiness he hadn't seen in 15 years. It was the stance of a duelist. It was the stance of a ghost. If you believe that true respect is earned in silence and proven through action, type competence below. The air in the Advanced Flight Simulation Center hummed with a unique tension, a mixture of ozone from the server racks, burnt coffee from the perpetually on pot in the corner, and the palpable anxiety of the half-dozen junior aviators waiting for their turn in the box, the centerpiece of the room. The simulator itself was a hulking hydraulic beast, a multi-million-dollar marvel of engineering designed to replicate the chaotic physics of aerial combat with brutal fidelity. Presiding over this technological kingdom was Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne, a man whose physical presence was as imposing as the machine he commanded. Thorne was a 20-year veteran, a former crew chief whose encyclopedic knowledge of naval aviation systems was matched only by his profound and openly expressed contempt for anyone he deemed unworthy of breathing his filtered air. This included, by his estimation, most commissioned officers, all civilian contractors, and today, specifically, the unassuming woman standing too close to his master control station. He had watched her for the past 10 minutes, a silent observer who had entered with Captain Miller's entourage, but had drifted away from the main tour group. She hadn't asked a single question. She hadn't touched a single piece of equipment. She just watched, her gaze sweeping over the complex arrays of switches, dials, and monitors with a quiet intensity that Thorne found infuriating. He saw nobody. He saw a slight, unimposing figure whose flight suit fit a little too loosely, a woman who lacked the easy, confident swagger of a seasoned pilot. She was an intrusion, a disruption to the carefully orchestrated symphony of his domain, and his pride, a brittle and jealously guarded thing, demanded he reassert his authority. He made a show of it, his voice booming in the quiet space, intentionally drawing the attention of the young ensigns. He wanted them to see. He wanted them to learn who was truly in charge here. He wanted to make an example of this anonymous, silent woman. Her lack of reaction was the most galling part. It was like shouting at a granite cliff face. There was no flicker of fear, no flash of anger, no hint of indignation. There was only that serene, analytical calm, a profound and unnerving silence that seemed to absorb his insults without a trace. Her focus remained locked on the telemetry flowing from the active simulation, where a young pilot, Ensign Davies, was being put through a grueling high-G combat scenario. Her head tilted ever so slightly, a minute adjustment, as if she were listening to a conversation no one else could hear, a silent dialogue between the pilot, the machine, and the unforgiving laws of physics. Thorne saw insolence in her stillness. Captain Miller, still watching from the periphery, saw something else entirely. He saw a professional at work. A sudden, piercing shriek from the simulator speakers shattered the tense quiet. A series of red lights flashed across the control panels, bathing the room in a hellish, pulsing glow. On the main monitor, the simulated F/A-18 Super Hornet tumbled through a digital sky, locked in a catastrophic, unrecoverable aerodynamic stall. "Mayday, mayday, I've lost control. I'm in flat spin." Ensign Davies' voice, strained with panic, crackled over the intercom. Gunnery Sergeant Thorne immediately bristled, his focus shifting from the woman to the crisis. This was his world, his disaster to manage. "Relax, Davies, you're not pulling enough G's to actually pass out," he barked, his voice dripping with scorn. "Just follow the damn procedure. Opposite rudder, stick forward, Neutralize ailerons. He strode toward the secondary control panel, needing access to the instructor's override system. The woman was still there, a silent, static obstacle in his path. He didn't ask her to move. He didn't sidestep. He simply lowered his shoulder and shoved her, not with overt violence, but with the dismissive, impatient force one might use on a piece of furniture. I said move, he snarled as her back made solid contact with a wall of humming server racks. The impact was jarring, the metallic clang echoing slightly in the sudden hush that followed the alarm. The other trainees flinched, their nervous amusement at Thorne's earlier insults instantly evaporating, replaced by a shared sense of shock. Captain Miller took a half-step forward, his jaw tight, a sharp reprimand forming on his lips. But the woman, once again, did nothing. She didn't cry out. She didn't even rub the spot where she'd hit the wall. She simply pushed herself off the rack, adjusted the front of her plain flight suit with a single, economical motion, and took one precise step to the side. Her eyes never left the main screen. In fact, they seemed to narrow, her focus intensifying as the simulated aircraft continued its death spiral. She saw what Thorne, in his arrogant bluster, had missed. It wasn't just pilot error. The cascade of warning lights, the specific telemetry errors flashing in amber at the bottom of the screen, it was a system failure. A deep, critical flaw in the simulation's code was fighting the pilot's inputs, creating a feedback loop that made recovery impossible. The standard procedure wouldn't work. It couldn't work. The machine was designed to teach, but in this moment, the machine itself had gone mad. Thorne, meanwhile, was pounding on the console, his face reddening with a mixture of fury and a dawning, terrifying sense of incompetence. "Damn it, Davies, what did you do? You broke my simulator," he roared, his authority crumbling into impotent rage. He was blaming the student for the failure of the master's tool. The woman watched him, her expression unreadable, a mask of pure, professional detachment. The silence she projected was no longer passive. It felt active, judgmental, a silent weighing of the man's worth in a moment of crisis. And in that silence, he was found wanting. The synthetic wail of the stall alarm intensified, a digital scream that signaled imminent, simulated impact. Altitude 8,000 feet. 7,000. I can't recover. Eject, eject, eject. Ensign Davies' voice was now a raw shout of terror, his training forgotten in the face of a scenario designed to be inescapable. On the monitor, the digital ground rushed up to meet the spinning jet. Gunnery Sergeant Thorne was frozen, his hands hovering uselessly over the controls. His expertise had hit a wall, a hard, unyielding limit defined by the lines of code that had just betrayed him. His entire identity, built on a foundation of absolute mastery over this system, was collapsing in real time in front of his trainees, his peers, and his commanding officer. The room was thick with the smell of failure. The other ensigns stared, their faces pale, witnessing not just a simulated crash, but the public dismantling of a formidable authority figure. They had feared Thorne, respected his knowledge, but now they saw him as something else, a man who was loud in calm and silent in crisis. It was in this precise moment of suspended chaos, of collective paralysis, that the woman finally moved. She took 2 deliberate steps forward, her worn flight boots making no sound on the polished concrete floor. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the noise of the alarms and the sergeant's heavy breathing with the clean, sharp authority of a scalpel. "I have control." Thorne whipped his head around, his eyes wide with disbelief and renewed anger. "You have what? Who the hell do you think you are?" he sputtered, gesturing wildly at the console. "This is a class 4 cascade failure. The system is locked. There's nothing to control." He was shouting, but his words lacked conviction. He was trying to assert a dominance he no longer felt, a desperate defense against the crushing evidence of his own inadequacy. The woman did not waste time or energy replying to his question. She simply slid into the now vacant secondary instructor's seat, her movements fluid and economical, devoid of any wasted motion. Her posture in the chair was perfect, a study in ergonomic efficiency. Her hands, which had been hanging loosely at her sides, now rose to the console, and in that instant, they transformed. They were no longer just hands. They were instruments of impossible precision and skill. They moved with a blurring speed, a surgeon's certainty, across the complex interface. Her fingers danced over the keyboard, typing in lines of command line code that weren't in any manual, obscure backdoor protocols known only to the system's original designers. She was not trying to fly the plane. She was not fighting the simulation. She was reprogramming it. Live, under duress. Her left hand darted to a small, unmarked panel below the main monitor, a diagnostic port usually reserved for factory technicians. With a flick of her fingers, she unlatched it, revealing a series of toggle switches and input dials. Thorne stared, dumbfounded. He had been the lead instructor on this simulator for 6 years and had never known that panel even existed. Manual override, hydraulic actuators. She murmured, her voice a low, calm monotone, speaking more to herself than to anyone in the room. She flipped 3 switches in a precise sequence. ECU to neutral. Bypassing stall spin logic, another switch. On the main screen, half of the red warning lights blinked out, replaced by amber standby indicators. The violent spin of the simulated aircraft began to slow, its rotation becoming less chaotic, more stable, but it was still falling, a 40,000-pound brick dropping from the sky. She stabilized the spin, but she's still in a stall. Altitude, 3,000 feet. She has no engine power. One of the other instructors whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and confusion. It's a dead stick. There's no way. Not from this altitude. The glide ratio is impossible. The woman's right hand moved to the instructor's flight stick and throttle, her grip light but firm. Her eyes were locked on the screen, but she wasn't just looking at the picture of the cockpit view. She was reading the fine print, the stream of raw data scrolling down the right side of the display, airspeed, angle of attack, energy state, sink rate. It was a language she understood as intimately as her own name. She was no longer just a technician. She was a pilot. She was flying the numbers, not the machine. With a series of almost imperceptible adjustments to the stick, she coaxed the nose of the digital Hornet down, trading precious altitude for crucial airspeed. The stall alarm finally fell silent. She had broken the stall. The aircraft was flying again, but without engines, it was now a glider. A very, very heavy glider. On the screen, a runway appeared in the distance, a tiny gray strip against a green landscape. It was miles away, far beyond the simulator's calculated glide path. A new message flashed on the screen in stark, red letters. Landing solution. Impossible. The woman's expression did not change. Her hands remained steady, her focus absolute. The room was so quiet that the hum of the cooling fan sounded like a roaring engine. Every single person, the trainees, the instructors, Sergeant Thorne, Captain Miller, was utterly transfixed, witnesses to an act of professional heresy, a defiance of the machine's own definition of reality. The digital jet soared silently, gracefully, its descent managed with a level of precision that bordered on the supernatural. The end of the runway grew closer, closer, until finally, with a gentle bump that was barely visible on screen, the wheels touched down. The aircraft rolled down the center line, perfectly stable, and came to a gentle stop. On the screen, the impossible message vanished, replaced by a single, green word. Landed. A collective, audible gasp filled the room. Then, deafening silence. Thorne stood utterly frozen, his mouth hanging open, his face a mask of shattered arrogance and pure, unadulterated shock. He slowly turned his head to look at the woman. That's not possible, he whispered, the words barely making it past his lips. Captain Miller finally moved, the spell of the moment broken. He walked forward, his footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. He didn't look at Thorne. He didn't look at the stunned trainees. He walked directly to a secure, hardened terminal in the corner of the room, a terminal that connected to the Navy's highest-level personnel database. A flicker of recognition had ignited into a raging fire of certainty in his mind. The stance, the impossible calm, the surgical precision, the complete and utter mastery of a crisis that had paralyzed a seasoned expert. It all connected to a memory he had buried deep, a classified after-action report he had read over a decade ago about a test pilot who had saved the prototype of the next-generation stealth fighter after a complete flight control failure over the unforgiving terrain of the Nevada desert. A pilot known only by their call sign, Ghost. His fingers tapped on the keyboard, the clicks sounding like hammer blows in the silent bay. He entered his command-level credentials, then typed a name he now suspected belonged to the quiet woman in the plain flight suit. The security prompt demanded a secondary authorization. He scanned his thumbprint. The system granted him access. A personnel file loaded onto the screen, Spartan and heavily redacted, but the essential details were there, glowing in crisp, white text against a black background. Captain Miller's eyes widened as he read. He had known she was a legend, a whispered myth among the elite test pilot community. He had no idea how far that legend had grown. He straightened his back, his posture shifting from that of a base commander to that of a subordinate officer addressing a superior of immense and undeniable stature. He had a duty to perform, not just to correct a breach of protocol, but to restore a sense of order to a universe that had just been turned upside down. The ensigns and instructors were still staring at the simulator screen, replaying the impossible landing in their minds. Gunnery Sergeant Thorne was still staring at the woman, his mind a chaotic whirl of confusion, humiliation, and a dawning, terrifying suspicion. He was beginning to understand that he hadn't just insulted a random officer. He had committed an act of professional suicide. The woman, for her part, simply leaned back in the instructor's chair, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She blinked slowly, as if coming out of a trance, her work now complete. She looked less like a pilot who had just performed a miracle and more like an accountant who had just finished balancing a ledger. The profound, effortless competence she radiated was more intimidating than any display of rank or authority could ever be. It was inherent. It was absolute. And the entire room was now suffocating under its weight, waiting for the judgment that was sure to come. Captain Miller turned from the terminal. His face was grim, his expression set like stone. He cleared his throat, and the sound made everyone, especially Sergeant Thorne, flinch. "Gunnery Sergeant Thorne," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Thorne snapped to a semblance of attention, his body rigid with dread. "Sergeant," Miller began, "you are a 20-year veteran of this Navy. You are entrusted with the training of our next generation of aviators, a position that requires not only technical expertise, but judgment, wisdom, the ability to recognize competence, even when it is not decorated with the rank you expect to see." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like a death sentence. He then turned his attention to the room at large, his voice rising in volume and authority. "All of you witnessed what happened here today. You witnessed a catastrophic system failure. You witnessed panic and a breakdown in procedure. And then, you witnessed a masterclass in crisis management." He turned his gaze back to the woman in the chair. He did not speak to her directly, but read from the information he had just accessed, his voice taking on the rhythmic, formal cadence of citation being read at an award ceremony. "Service record. Hayes, Evelyn. Call sign, Ghost." A murmur went through the instructors. The call sign was legendary, a boogeyman story told to new test pilots at Patuxent River. Flight hours, over 8,000. For 1,216 in combat environments, the ensigns gasped. That was more combat time than their last 3 squadron commanders combined. Decorations include the Distinguished Flying Cross with 3 oak leaf clusters, the Silver Star, the Navy Cross. Miller's voice grew stronger, each medal a hammer blow against Thorne's ignorance. She was the lead test pilot for the XF-45 Aurora project, the very platform this simulator is based on. She didn't just fly it. She wrote half the code for the flight control system you use every day. "Sergeant," he let that information sink in, a revelation so profound it fundamentally reordered the reality of the room. She hadn't hacked the system. She had simply accessed her own work. Miller took a deep breath before delivering the final, crushing piece of information. Her current assignment, as of 0600 this morning. "Commander, United States 7th Fleet." He paused, then snapped his body to the straightest, most formal posture of his career. He raised his hand in a salute so crisp it seemed to cut the air. His voice, now booming with a respect that bordered on pure reverence, filled every corner of the simulator bay. "Admiral Hayes, on behalf of my command, I apologize for the unprofessional reception you have received. Welcome to Naval Air Station Lemoore." For a long moment, there was nothing but the hum of the servers. Then, one by one, every other person in the room, the instructors, the terrified ensigns, the civilian technicians who had come running, snapped to attention and saluted. All except for one man. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne stood completely still, his face as white as a sheet, his eyes locked on the four-star admiral sitting calmly in his chair. He had not just insulted an officer. He had shoved, humiliated, and disrespected his new fleet commander. The quiet woman he had dismissed as an aide was one of the most powerful and decorated officers in the entire United States Navy. The story of what happened in Simulator Bay 3 spread through the base like a shockwave. It traveled from the hushed whispers of the ensigns in the mess hall to the boisterous, embellished retelling by pilots at the officers' club, to the quiet, head-shaking disbelief of the senior NCOs in their lounge. The tale acquired its own mythology almost instantly. They called it the ghosting of Gunny Thorne. They spoke of the quiet, unassuming woman in the sterile flight suit who had walked into the lion's den and tamed the beast not with a roar, but with a whisper of competence. The details became legendary. The impossible dead-stick landing, the secret command codes, the revelation of her identity, and Captain Miller's thunderous salute. The incident became a parable, a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumption and the true nature of authority. It wasn't about the rank on your collar. It was about the skill in your hands and the calm in your heart. Gunnery Sergeant Thorne was formally summoned to Captain Miller's office an hour later. The dressing down was brutal, not because Miller shouted, but because he didn't. He spoke in a low, disappointed tone, expressing his profound failure as a leader for allowing such a culture of arrogant gatekeeping to fester under his command. Thorne was officially relieved of his duties as chief instructor and reassigned to a logistics billet, a desk job buried deep in the administrative bowels of the base. It was a humiliating fall from grace, a public neutering of the man who had ruled his small kingdom with an iron fist. But the punishment was secondary to the internal reckoning Thorne was facing. He spent the next few days in a state of profound shock and shame. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her calm, analytical face. He heard her quiet voice cutting through the chaos. He felt the phantom pressure of her back against the server rack, a moment of casual disrespect that now felt like a sacrilege. He had built his entire identity on being the expert, the one who knew. In a single 5-minute span, this quiet woman had systematically dismantled his expertise, exposed his ignorance, and revealed his character to be hollow. He hadn't just been proven wrong. He had been revealed as a fool. The arrogance that had been his armor for 2 decades had been shattered, and for the first time, he was forced to look at the insecure, prideful man underneath. It was not a pleasant sight. He realized his prejudice wasn't just about officers. It was about anyone who didn't fit his narrow, rigid definition of what a warrior should look and sound like. Admiral Hayes was the living, breathing refutation of his entire worldview. A week later, Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, now in his service uniform, stood waiting outside a temporary office in the base's command wing. He had requested, through official channels, a formal audience with Admiral Hayes. He expected to be denied, or at best, to be met by an aide who would accept his written apology. After a 20-minute wait that felt like a lifetime, the door opened. Admiral Hayes stood there, now in her crisp, white service dress, the 4 silver stars on her collar seeming to shine with an impossible brightness. "Sergeant," she said, her voice even and devoid of any lingering anger. She simply gestured for him to enter. He walked in and stood at attention before her desk. He did not offer excuses or try to explain his behavior. He looked her directly in the eye, his own gaze filled with a shame so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Admiral," he began, his voice cracking slightly, "there is no excuse for my conduct. My disrespect was unprofessional, and my actions were inexcusable. I failed as a leader, as an instructor, and as a United States Marine. I formally and profoundly apologize." He stood there, braced for a tirade, for the official end of his career. Admiral Hayes looked at him for a long moment, her expression once again unreadable. Then, she gave a slight nod. "Your apology is accepted, Sergeant Thorne," she said. "The Navy has already disciplined you. I am not interested in punishing you further. I am interested in what you learned." Thorne was taken aback. "Ma'am," he asked, confused. "You were in a crisis," she explained, her voice taking on the quality of teacher. "Your tools failed you, and your knowledge reached its limit. Instead of adapting, you defaulted to anger and blame. That is the lesson. Arrogance is a shield for insecurity. Competence doesn't need to be loud. See the sailor, Sergeant, not the uniform, or in my case, the lack thereof. That is how you will truly serve this Navy." She paused. You are a man with 20 years of valuable technical knowledge. Do not let one moment of prideful failure erase that. Learn from it. Teach others what you have learned. That is your path back. Dismissed, Thorne stood there for a moment, stunned by her response. It was not forgiveness, not exactly. It was a directive, a challenge, a chance for redemption offered by the very person he had wronged so grievously. He rendered the sharpest salute of his life, his eyes stinging with emotion. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice thick. He turned and walked out of her office, a broken man, but one who had just been handed the blueprint for how to rebuild himself. The legend of that day continued to grow, and a small, unofficial tradition began. A small, brass plaque was quietly affixed to the side of the simulator's instructor console. It didn't mention her rank or the incident. It simply read, "Admiral E. Hayes, the ghost in the machine." It became a touchstone, a reminder. The advanced recovery sequence she had used to land the simulated jet was officially integrated into the training syllabus, codenamed the Hayes Maneuver, and it became the ultimate test of an aspiring pilot's skill. A year passed. The culture at NAS Lemoore had subtly but significantly shifted. The story of Admiral Hayes had become a foundational piece of institutional folklore, a lesson taught to every new batch of trainees on their first day. It was a story about humility, respect, and the quiet professionalism that defined the very best of their service. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne was still at the base. He had served his time in the logistics department, but Captain Miller, seeing the profound change in the man, had eventually, with Admiral Hayes' quiet approval, allowed him to return to the simulator bay. But he was a different instructor now. The booming arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, demanding patience. He was tougher on his students than ever before, but he was also fairer. He pushed them to their limits, but he was the first to offer guidance when they struggled. He had a particular eye for the quiet ones, the trainees who didn't fit the stereotypical mold of the hotshot fighter pilot. He saw them, and he made a point to mentor them, to draw out the competence he knew might be hiding behind a mask of insecurity or shyness. One afternoon, he was overseeing a young ensign, a woman named Peterson who was exceptionally bright but lacked confidence, often faltering under pressure. She was in the box, facing the dreaded Hayes maneuver. The alarms blared, the red lights flashed, and she entered the catastrophic flat spin. On the intercom, her breathing was ragged with panic. The old Thorne would have berated her, tore her down for her weakness. The new Thorne leaned into his microphone, his voice calm and steady. "Breathe, Peterson. You know the procedure. It's not about the machine, it's about you. Fly the numbers, not the fear. I know you can do this." He watched as she fought her panic, her hands moving on the controls, clumsy at first, then with a growing certainty. She initiated the manual override sequence. She broke the stall. She put the nose down and began the long, silent glide back to the runway. It wasn't as elegant as the Admiral's, not as perfect, but it was successful. As the simulated jet rolled to a stop on the runway, a cheer went up from the other trainees watching in the bay. Thorne allowed himself a small, rare smile. He keyed the mic one last time. "Good work, Peterson." The ghost would be proud. He looked over at the small brass plaque on the console, a constant reminder of the day his world was broken and then rebuilt on a stronger foundation. The legacy of Admiral Evelyn Hayes at that air station was not the name maneuver or the plaque that bore her call sign. Her true legacy was the quiet, profound cultural shift she had inspired with a single act of undeniable competence. It was in the way instructors now looked for potential in the most unassuming trainees. It was in the newfound humility of a once arrogant sergeant who now taught lessons of character alongside lessons of aerodynamics. It was in the confidence of a young ensign Peterson, who knew her worth was not defined by her gender or her demeanor, but by her ability to perform under pressure. The story served as an enduring lesson. True strength doesn't need to announce its presence. It doesn't require validation or applause. It simply is. It waits, patiently, for a moment of crisis to reveal itself, not through words, but through decisive, effective action. Admiral Hayes never returned to that simulator bay. She was commanding a fleet, a silent guardian on the turbulent waters of the world. But a part of her remained, a ghost in the machine, a standard of quiet professionalism against which all others were measured. Her silence that day had not been a sign of weakness or submission. It was the calm at the eye of a hurricane of skill, the quiet confidence of a master who knew her worth and felt no need to prove it to anyone but herself. True legacy isn't what you leave behind in plaques and stories. It's what continues forward in the actions and character of those you inspire. It is the echo of competence, resounding long after the initial act is over. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.